He wasn't supposed to be there, just an old man in a rain-soaked coat, clutching a faded photograph on a cold bench no one noticed. Then a Navy SEAL and his trained canine walked by. The dog, trained to confront the thirfrat's fiats without hesitation, suddenly stopped, lowered his head, and gently leaned against the old man. The SEAL froze. Because this wasn't just any old man, and that wasn't just any dog. What happened next felt less like coincidence, and more like a miracle. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Cold rain drifted over Seattle like a thin gray veil. In the haze of late autumn, the air smelled faintly of wet cedar, engine fumes, and the metallic tang of the lake nearby. The city pulsed with motion, yet one man seemed untouched by it. Walter Hayes sat alone on the weathered bus stop bench, as if rooted to the damp wood itself. He was 70 years old, but the years had carved him far deeper than time usually dares. His frame, once confident and upright, now curved inward like a man protecting a fragile flame inside his chest. His back hunched slightly, as if gravity insisted on reminding him of choices he could never take back. His hands, veined, spotted, and thin, were half hidden inside the sleeves of a faded wool coat. That coat used to be a rich forest green. Now it resembled old pine needles left to decay. His beard was silver white, trimmed neatly out of habit rather than vanity, though the stubble on his chin suggested the razor had lost against exhaustion that morning. His eyes were pale gray, almost translucent. The kind of eyes that had seen too much without learning how to forget. A thin tremor in his fingers betrayed the cold, but the real shaking came from inside. A nervous twitch that came from memories he wished he could sand away like splinters. Across the road, cars hissed along slick pavement, their tires slicing through puddles. Commuters hurried under umbrellas, shoulders hunched, collars raised against the rain. No one stopped long enough to notice the old man in the soaked coat, or the tiny photograph he kept pinched between his thumb and stiff forefinger. The photograph had once been glossy, but raindrops and years had worn it down to a fragile slip of paper. It showed a young woman in her early 20s with hair the color of caramel and a smile that held sunlight. She was laughing in the picture, though the sound no longer existed anywhere except in Walter's mind. That laugh had once been able to pull him out of the darkest storms, and it haunted him now because he could not remember the last time he had earned it. Her name was Emma Hayes. She was his daughter, or at least she used to be. Memories rose and collected behind his ribcage like water pressing against a fragile dam. Years ago, when Emma left for her first internship, he had stood exactly here beside her, lecturing her about being cautious in a big city, insisting she call every night. He had believed worry was just another form of love, but control had an ugly way of disguising itself as protection. He remembered, against his will, the final argument. He had seen her dreams as foolish. She had seen his expectations as chains. The night she left, she did not take her suitcase. She did not take her books. She only took her courage. Walter had never forgiven himself for being the reason she needed courage in her own home. Now he came to this bus stop every day, not because he expected her to return, but because this bench was the last place he had been a father. The rain intensified, slipping from the tips of his silver hair and down his weather-creased cheeks like unwelcome tears. Seattle's skyline blurred behind misted air, glass towers fading into clouds, old brick buildings glistening under streetlights that flickered like tiny lighthouses guiding nobody home. A passing bicyclist splashed a small wave onto his boots. Walter didn't flinch. Pain no longer startled him. It merely confirmed he was still here. The muscles around his jaw tightened. He slipped a business photograph back into the interior pocket of his coat, always the left pocket, over the heart, as if placement could change the past. He had started this ritual almost without realizing. Arrive before sunrise, sit in silence, and leave only when the ache became too visible to hide. A small bus shelter roof shielded part of the bench, but Walter sat beyond it, letting the rain soak into him. He wanted the discomfort. He wanted the world to press upon him, to match the heaviness inside. Some memories deserve to be cold. In the distance, across the wet pavement, a city bus slowed. Its headlights washed over Walter, revealing more of the sorrow etched on his face. He didn't rise. He never boarded. Drivers learned to expect the old man sitting at the bench, but not the old man on board. He was a landmark now, like a statue built from quiet regret. The bus rolled forward, leaving Walter alone with the rain. He recalled small moments that should have saved everything. Emma bringing him silly socks shaped like cartoon animals, Emma taping her college acceptance letter on the fridge so he would accidentally find it, Emma sitting across from him at breakfast practicing how to pronounce French film directors. He remembered every detail of her voice except the moment it broke while saying goodbye. His chest tightened. Walter pressed his palm flat against the bench beside him, grounding himself the way a drowning man reaches for something solid. The wood was gritty and cold beneath his hand. He imagined Emma sitting next to him, swinging her legs, impatient for the bus that would take her toward possibility. She had once told him that bus stops were magical because they were small places that led to large places. He had laughed then, dismissing her romanticism. If only he had known how fleeting the magic was. Now the only magic left was the painful one, the ability of memory to bring back what the heart can no longer hold. A pedestrian jogged past, splashing water onto the curb. She glanced briefly at Walter, just long enough to wonder if he was homeless, then disappeared into the curtain of rain. Walter wasn't homeless. He lived 3 blocks away, in a small apartment that smelled of old coffee grounds and moth-eaten wool. But in a way that mattered, he was homeless. His home had been Emma's laughter, Emma's stories, Emma's future. When she walked away, she took home with her. Rain thudded against his coat, heavy enough to soak through the lining. He didn't pull the collar up. He wanted to feel the world exactly as it was, sharp, cold, unsoftened. He finally let his eyelids close, allowing the world to blur. Inside, his mind replayed the last time Emma stood in this spot. She had held a tote bag filled with freshly printed resumes, her cheeks flushed pink from excitement. Her hair, damp from the drizzle, clung to her cheeks. She had smiled at him, not knowing it would be the last smile he would earn without effort. He could still hear her voice without needing to remember the words. The rain eventually softened into a mist, delicate and cold, like breath on glass. Walter opened his eyes and stared at the empty street. In his ribs, hope and guilt tangled into something heavy. He whispered nothing. He prayed nothing. He simply waited. Somewhere deep within him, a thought pulsed quietly. If I stay here long enough, maybe she'll find me. The chapter closed itself without fanfare. Just an old man, a cold bench, and a photograph pressed against his heart. Rain continued its whisper across the pavement as Jack Carter approached the bus stop with purposeful, quiet steps. He carried himself with the stillness of someone who had learned to measure every angle of the world. Jack was 37, tall, broad shoulders beneath a charcoal tactical rain jacket that clung to him like a second skin. His jawline was sharp, dusted with 2 days of stubble, the kind that hinted at exhaustion rather than neglect. His eyes were a piercing shade of steel blue, eyes that had watched life and death dance too closely on sand-colored battlefields. The right side of his face bore a barely visible scar that ran from temple to jaw, a thin silver reminder of an explosion in Kandahar, an explosion that had taken half of his team and left him with a silence inside that even the ocean couldn't fill. The dog at his side, Ranger, was 4 years old, coated in thick sable fur streaked with black, a muscular German shepherd bred for precision. His ears were sharp triangles, alert to every shift of sound. His stride revealed perfect symmetry. Each step was measured, controlled, like a warrior refusing to waste movement. Ranger wore a dark harness fitted with reflective threading and a small embroidered patch that read, "K9, do not disturb." Though retired from active service, Jack still made sure Ranger trained every morning. Scent work, response drills, pressure and release exercises. Ranger had memorized the rhythm of Jack's breath. Jack had learned to read the language hidden in Ranger's posture. They were each other's compass when the world tilted. As they neared the bus stop, Ranger's body changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. His pace slowed, muscles tightened beneath his fur, his head dipped low, inhaling deeply. Jack scanned the surroundings out of habit, seeing nothing threatening. A bus stop, wet streets, a lone elderly man. Ranger moved closer to the bench. Jack knew that specific change well. Ranger wasn't reacting to danger, but to human distress. Trained combat dogs could read heart rates and the chemical signals of fear or grief. They could identify emotional fracture before a person even realized they were breaking. Rain gathered in silver beads on Ranger's coat as he lowered himself onto his haunches beside the old man, pressing the weight of his body gently against Walter's leg. It was deliberate contact, the kind Ranger reserved for soldiers having panic attacks during transport flights. Jack hesitated. He had seen Ranger react to veterans with trauma. He had never seen the dog approach a civilian on the street without command. Jack removed his gloves slowly, pushing his damp hair back. The wind carried the unfamiliar scent of wet concrete and old metal. Something here was different. The old man did not react to Ranger's presence. Walter Hayes stared at the rain as if trying to memorize each drop before it hit the ground. His shoulders were rounded forward, rigid in their sorrow. Beneath his soaked coat, his frail chest rose and fell with small, uneven breaths that revealed his emotional exhaustion. Jack studied him, observing the slack posture, the sunken cheeks, the slight tremor not caused by weather but by grief. A navy blue thermos lay by Walter's side, unopened. Jack crouched slightly to get a better view of the situation, and that's when he noticed the left pocket of the coat bulging in the shape of a folded photograph. Ranger nudged Walter's hand again, more firmly this time, a soft whine escaping his throat. Jack had seen Ranger comfort soldiers who had lost brothers. He had seen the dog drag wounded men out of smoke-filled rooms. But seeing him cling to an old stranger on a rainy sidewalk stirred something deep in Jack's chest. The old man finally blinked, not in surprise, but in surrender, as though feeling a living creature touch him broke something he had been trying to protect. Walter's eyes dropped to Ranger's fur, wet, warm, steady. His hand moved with hesitance, pausing midair before resting gently on Ranger's head. Jack could feel the shift in energy even from where he stood, grief giving way, not to relief, but to recognition. The photograph in Walter's coat slipped slightly, revealing the corner of a smiling young woman's face. Jack didn't pry. He merely filed the detail away, the same way he had been trained to collect intel. A drizzle of water gathered on Ranger's snout and dripped down like a tear, while Walter's thumb rubbed the dog's fur in slow, tentative strokes. Jack crossed his arms, leaning back slightly, letting Ranger guide the encounter. His body always remained positioned toward the street, a habit from combat zones. Never turn your back to an open field. A bus passed, spraying mist onto the curb. Walter didn't move, didn't speak, just continued staring at the horizon as though waiting for something only he could see. Jack recognized the posture. It was the posture of men waiting for ghosts. Without thinking about it, Jack reached into his back pocket and pulled out a protein bar. Not a grand gesture, just something to interrupt the weight hanging in the air. The wind slapped rain against Jack's jacket, but he stayed still. He wasn't the type who comforted strangers. He wasn't the type who stayed when things got emotionally messy, but Ranger stayed. And Jack had learned that Ranger often walked toward the very places Jack had spent his life avoiding. A low rumble approached from down the street, a delivery truck turning into the adjacent alley. Ranger's head lifted, ears rotating toward the noise, analyzing, categorizing, then relaxing when he determined no threat. The moment highlighted how trained Ranger truly was, hyper-aware but calm, attentive but discerning. Jack watched the old man's hands, noticing the tremble in the fingertips. Something in that tremor reflected Jack's own past, the nights when explosions echoed in his dreams, and the only thing keeping him tethered to consciousness was Ranger pressing against his ribs. Wind carried the scent of the lake, cool and damp. Walter finally shifted slightly, moving to adjust his coat, and Jack saw the photograph more clearly now. The same young woman, smile bright, hair windblown, joy captured in its purest moment. The rain pooled at Walter's feet, reflecting blurry headlights and streaks of city life that rushed past without mercy. And yet, here on a forgotten corner of Seattle, time felt suspended. Ranger leaned more firmly, anchoring Walter to the present. Jack felt something unfamiliar, not pity, but responsibility. Ranger had chosen this man, and Jack trusted Ranger's instincts more than his own. Ranger pressed his body a little closer. Walter's hand tightened gently into his fur. The old man's shoulders shook, not from cold, but from the fragile, painful unraveling of a heart that had stayed clenched for too long. And for the first time that morning, Walter Hayes allowed himself to breathe differently, slowly, fully, like someone surfacing from water. In Seattle's rain, a retired soldier and a grieving father intersected not by coincidence, but by the instinct of a dog who understood pain better than most humans. Ranger anchored them both to the same moment. Walter didn't know it yet, but the life he thought had ended was about to open again. The photograph had slipped from Walter's fingers as though the rain itself had pried it loose, and the wind, sharp, swift, coming off the lake, carried it down the slick pavement. Ranger sprinted after it without hesitation, paws splashing through rainwater, body fluid and sure, as though retrieving memories were part of his training. When he returned, the photo clamped gently in his jaws. Jack instinctively scanned the area again. his eyes sharp and tactical. Years of combat had taught him to read chaos before it formed, to see patterns in randomness. But what he saw this time wasn't danger, it was a woman. She stepped out of the cafe's doorway and into the rain, unaware of how profoundly her simple movement would alter the atmosphere around the bus stop. Her appearance cut through the grayness like a sudden flare. She was in her late 20s, slender, with dark brown hair that fell in careless wet strands around her face. Her coat, olive green, belted at the waist, looked like something chosen for functionality rather than fashion, yet it suited her. Beneath it, jeans hugged legs shaped by long walks rather than gym memberships. Her hands were small, almost delicate, but her posture suggested someone accustomed to carrying weight far heavier than shopping bags. Her face, the face that matched the photograph, carried a kind of tired resilience. Not defeat, but exhaustion, the kind that forms when a person keeps running, yet never outruns the thing inside them. Her eyes were a deep, quiet hazel, earthy, steady, and shadowed by the remnants of unspoken regret. Her name was Emma Hayes. For years, she had carried a bitter memory of her father's stubbornness, his controlling warnings, his inability to hear her dreams without filtering them through fear. She had left not because she didn't love him, but because she didn't know how to breathe in a life he kept tightening around her. And now, months into a draining job, alone in a city too wide for one heart, she had walked into a cafe by the water just to rest. She had no idea her father sat 50 feet away, drowning in rain and memories. Ranger stopped at her feet, placing the photograph gently against the toe of her boot. Emma froze. Her gaze dropped to the wet pavement, where her own smiling face stared back at her from years ago, and the sharp breath she pulled in shook her entire frame. Her throat tightened. Her heartbeat stumbled. She reached down with trembling fingers. The moment she touched the photograph, her eyes flicked upward, and she saw him. Walter sat on the soaked bench, unmoving, the rain curving over the brim of his brow. He looked smaller than she remembered, as if grief had carved away pieces of him. His coat clung to his frail shoulders, and his silver beard framed a mouth pressed into a thin, unsteady line. There was something heavy in his gaze, not fear, not anger, but a helplessness she had never seen in him before. It was as if time had taken his pride and left only longing. Emma's chest tightened. Years of unresolved words surged upward, threatening to drown her. She stood rooted, her hand clutching the damp photograph, her other hand gripping the cafe's doorframe as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Jack instinctively stepped between the two, just enough to observe both, ready to intervene if Walter collapsed. Not because he expected conflict, but because Ranger's behavior had shifted again. The dog pressed himself against Emma's leg now, offering the same grounding presence he had given Walter only minutes before. Ranger didn't judge. Ranger simply knew who needed anchoring. Jack watched the emotional collision with the wariness of someone who had learned that quiet moments can detonate without warning. People underestimate emotional shock. He'd seen grown soldiers crumble when confronted with something they weren't prepared to feel. Emma slowly crossed the sidewalk, her boots sending ripples through the shallow puddles. Walter didn't move. He didn't wipe his face. He didn't shield himself from the rain. He sat perfectly still, as if afraid any motion might shatter the fragile reality forming in front of him. Emma stopped just outside arm's reach. The air between them held threads of everything unsaid. Years of silence, stubbornness, love, anger, loss. Walter's eyes traveled up, slow and disbelieving, to meet hers. His breathing stalled. Her presence tore through him more completely than any winter ever could. His heart, brittle from waiting, almost hurt at the sight of her. Not because she was older or because she had changed, but because she was real, not a memory, not a ghost. Ranger nudged her again, his fur brushing her leg. It was the kind of touch that asked a question without words. "Are you going to run again?" Emma swallowed hard, her throat aching. Her hand flexed around the photograph. Her pulse felt too loud in her head. She wanted to speak, to break the unbearable silence, to apologize, to demand an apology, to rage, to cry, to do anything other than stand there and feel everything at once. But she had spent years building emotional armor, and Walter had spent years tearing himself apart in regret. Neither knew how to take the first step. Jack shifted his weight, ready to redirect Ranger if needed. The rain softened slightly, thinning into a delicate mist. Emma's breathing steadied, but her chest still rose with the kind of effort that betrayed an internal storm. Walter's hand twitched, almost rising, then falling again. He didn't trust himself to reach for her, not when he feared she might disappear the moment he tried to hold on. Time stretched around them, not frozen, but slowed, like a deep breath held by the city itself. Walter finally lowered his gaze to Ranger, then to the photograph held in Emma's hand. In that small motion, something gave way inside her. A thread pulled loose. A wall cracked. The photograph trembled between her fingers. Ranger leaned into her leg again, solid and sure, a grounding weight in a moment when gravity didn't feel reliable. Jack exhaled once, a slow, steady release. The rain, the wind, the city noise, they all faded into background blur. In the middle of a gray Seattle morning, Emma Hayes and Walter Hayes stood in front of each other for the first time in years. No words, just recognition. The painful, overwhelming acknowledgement that both had been waiting for this moment. Whether they were ready or not, the past had finally caught up to them. Steam curled upward from the rim of the ceramic mug, delicate wisps rising and vanishing into the air, as if grief could evaporate in the same quiet way. The cafe was small and warm, tucked into the corner of the waterfront promenade. Its windows faced the lake, and the rain streaked across the glass like ink pulled by gravity. The wood-paneled walls were decorated with framed photographs of sailboats and lighthouse silhouettes. The place had the kind of easy familiarity that made strangers feel safe to stay longer than it intended. Walter, Emma, Jack, and Ranger settled into a booth near the window, the fabric seat dampened by their coats. Ranger, ever observant, placed himself beneath Emma's legs, front paws crossed neatly, chin resting near her ankle. His coat, dark and slick from the rain, dampened the floor, but he lay without concern, eyes half closed, breath steady, and as though his entire being existed solely to absorb the tension radiating from the humans above him. Emma wrapped her hands around the mug, not because she was cold, but because she needed something to hold on to that wasn't a memory. The mug radiated heat into her palms, grounding her, drawing her attention away from the collapsing storm inside her chest. Walter sat across from her, his posture rigid, his coat still clinging to his shoulders like a weight he couldn't shrug off. Without the barrier of rain and distance, the details of his age were sharper, the fine creases fanning from the corners of his eyes, the downturned mouth shaped by too many silent days, the slight sag in his jawline from sleepless nights. He kept his hands on the table, fingertips brushing one another, as though afraid to fold them into his lap and be seen as uncertain. Jack occupied the end of the booth, his body angled outward rather than inward, an unconscious habit formed from years of combat, keeping his back to the wall and his view of the door unobstructed. The shadow of his scar caught the cafe's soft light, revealing its jagged path along his skin. The cafe's barista, Sarah Monroe, approached the table with quiet curiosity. She was in her mid-40s, tall and slender, with long, dark blonde hair pulled loosely into a ponytail and streaks of early gray at her temples that lent her an air of wisdom. Her skin held the golden undertones of someone raised beneath warmer suns. Laugh lines surrounded her eyes, not creased from joy, but from compassion worn into habit. Sarah moved with the certainty of someone who had carried heavy things alone and learned not to flinch beneath their weight. Her sweatshirt sleeves were pushed up, revealing faint burn scars along her forearm, evidence of years spent working behind espresso machines. She had seen enough broken people at her counter to recognize the shape of their silence. She placed the drinks on the table with a gentle touch, lingering for a second as she took in the trio, one young woman holding back tears, one old man clutching sorrow, like a fragile artifact, one former soldier scanning the exits even while seated. She offered a soft smile, the kind that didn't pry. Her voice was low, warm as honey in tea. Then she stepped away, leaving them with space to breathe. A slow rhythm filled the booth, rain against glass, inhaling and exhaling, the soft hum of conversation from other tables. Emma lifted her gaze to the window. Outside, the lake shimmered, reflecting the city's lights into long, fractured streaks. Walter watched her, with the reverence of someone witnessing a miracle they thought lost to time. His chest ached, not from age, but from the fragile, terrifying belief that she might allow him back into her world. Emma finally looked away from the window toward her father. She studied the slope of his shoulders, the tremor of his fingers, the exhaustion in his eyes. He wasn't the immovable, iron-willed figure she remembered. He looked breakable, human. She reached down without thought, fingers brushing the soft fur behind Ranger's ear. Ranger leaned into the touch instinctively, emitting a soft sigh that vibrated through the booth like a permission slip. Permission to feel, permission to soften. Jack observed the shift, the way Ranger mirrored the emotional temperature of the table. Ranger had always been a barometer for distress, but here, in this moment, he was something else. The hinge between past rupture and potential healing. Something inside Emma cracked open, quietly. She felt the weight of smaller memories returning. Her father teaching her how to skip stones across the lake, buying her lemon sherbet every summer, falling asleep on the couch with newspapers covering him like a shield. She remembered his pride disguised as worry. Walter watched her hands, the same way he once watched her take her first steps. His heart pounded too hard. He feared that speaking would scatter the pieces they were barely holding together. Instead, he inhaled slowly, an uneven, shaky breath, and wrapped his palms around his own mug. The cocoa inside smelled faintly of cinnamon and childhood. Rain streaked the glass beside them. The city, blurred by mist, seemed to soften its edges. A tiny shift, so subtle it almost never existed. Emma leaned forward, just slightly, and Walter did the same, as if two magnets had finally stopped resisting. Ranger nudged Walter's shin, prompting him to rest his hand beside Emma's on the table. Their hands did not touch, but the gap between them was smaller than the one that had lived in their hearts for years. Jack took a slow drink of his coffee, watching the space between father and daughter shrink. His expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes eased. He had rescued men from rubble and from enemy fire. This felt quieter, but no less significant. The three shared the same air, the same table, the same moment, bound not by words, but by the strange, unstoppable truth that time sometimes bends toward healing. Outside, the rain weakened into a soft drizzle. Lights flickered gently across the lake like lanterns left to guide wandering souls home. Inside the cafe, warmth gathered around the booth, not from the heater or the cocoa, but from the fragile courage of two hearts daring to remember how to care. The gap that had defined their years was no longer an empty void. It was a space being slowly filled, with breath, presence, acknowledgement. Ranger shifted positions and rested his head on the booth's edge. His eyes closed, satisfied. He had done enough, for now. In the stillness, something changed. The rain from earlier had washed the streets into a reflective sheen, the pavement holding the last traces of water like thin glass. By late afternoon, Seattle softened under a sunset that rarely appeared this time of year. The sky stretched out in pale amber and rose, the colors threading themselves through the branches of the maple trees that lined the lakeside walkway. The air was still damp, but gentler now, a calm exhale after hours of held breath. Jack Carter walked ahead with steady strides, each movement purposeful. His dark tactical jacket hung open now, no longer clinging to him with the intensity of the downpour. The rain had eased the salt along the scar on his face, leaving it a softer silver under the evening light. Ranger walked beside him, strong and attentive. Though trained for combat, his posture now was different. His ears were upright, but his body relaxed, as if sensing that this moment was not one of danger, but of transition. Walter Hayes followed behind. He walked slowly, one hand lightly steadying himself on Emma's arm. The earlier stiffness in his posture had softened. His shoulders, once bent under the weight of years of regret, now held the smallest hint of lift, as though the simple act of being accompanied had shifted the burden. His thin wool coat lifted slightly in the breeze. His beard, still damp, held the scent of rain and cocoa. Emma matched his pace. She was still slender, still carrying fatigue in the small tension of her jaw, but her steps were no longer hesitant. Her chestnut hair was tied back loosely with the tie Jack had loaned her from his wrist. The damp strands stuck to her neck, but she didn't mind. She was exactly where she was meant to be. They reached the bench, Walter's rain-soaked sanctuary, the wooden witness to years of aching hope. Water glistened on the slats of the seat, transforming them into streaks of gold under the sinking sun. Jack set his backpack down on the ground. He pulled out a small metal plaque, brushed off droplets of rain still clinging to its brushed silver surface, and held it for a moment. His fingers traced the engraving he had ordered earlier that week, not knowing the full reason why. Lost men sometimes prepared for miracles long before they occurred. He knelt. The earth beneath him smelled of wet leaves and cold soil. Ranger stood nearby, watchful. Years of training had taught Ranger to remain alert even when things seemed peaceful, but something in this moment made him lower his head respectfully, like a soldier standing at attention. Jack removed a screwdriver from a pouch and began fastening the plaque to the backrest. The screws sank into the wood grain with soft resistance. Walter stood close enough to hear the turning metal, a steady, grounding sound. Emma's gaze moved from Jack's scarred hands to the plaque, then to the sky. Something inside her loosened, as though the knot of years finally began to uncoil. The sun dipped farther down, filtering through the trees until the park glowed with a quiet, sacred warmth. Jack tightened the final screw. Then he stepped aside. The words on the plaque caught the evening light. For those who wait, for those who return. No waiting is ever wasted when the heart still loves. Walter raised his hand slowly. His palm hovered above the plaque before finally settling against the cool metal. His hand shook, not from age, but from the release of something long held inside. The bench was no longer a place where hope suffered. It was now a marker of where hope was fulfilled. Emma stood beside him, gently looping her arm through his. Their bodies leaned slightly together, not from dependency, but from a shared understanding that forgiveness didn't need ceremony, it needed presence. Ranger sat at Walter's feet, tail curled neatly against his side, eyes scanning the lake. He looked like a guardian, calm and solemn. His posture held no tension. It was the posture of a warrior who knew the mission was complete. Jack stood a few steps away, shoulder leaning against a lamppost. Evening shadows wrapped around him, softening the sharp lines of his jaw. He looked toward Walter and Emma with a sense of quiet satisfaction, not pride. His life had been built on protecting others, but rarely had he witnessed what came after safety, what came after reconnection. In them, he saw something that no battlefield could ever offer: restoration. A jogger passed by, just a man in athletic shorts, earbuds in, breath steady. But as he ran past the three figures at the bench, he slowed. Something about the scene, the dog, the old man, the young woman, made him glance back. He didn't know the story, but he recognized its weight. Some moments didn't need explanation to matter. Sarah Monroe watched from inside the cafe. She leaned her arms on the window frame, chin resting on her forearm. The light from inside illuminated the soft scars on her wrist and the curve of her smile. She wasn't part of the story, not directly, but she had spent years witnessing quieter versions of what was unfolding, the way people came in broken and left lighter. That evening, she watched three silhouettes become something whole again. Time passed in silence. Leaves rustled gently overhead. The deep amber light shifted into dusk, then twilight. Walter finally sat down on the bench, not out of exhaustion this time, but out of belonging. Emma sat beside him. Jack and Ranger stood a few feet away, giving them space. Walter exhaled a long, uneven breath, not a sigh of regret, a release, the kind of breath a man makes when a burden is finally put down. Emma leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. They didn't cling. They didn't cling because clinging implied fear of losing again. And this moment held no fear. Ranger shifted, circled once, then lay at Walter's feet. His breathing slowed into a steady rhythm. Jack looked out across the lake, the vast, endless reflection of sky upon water. He didn't know what tomorrow held for Walter and Emma, but he knew this quiet moment was enough. The city lights flickered on one by one, shining across the lake like a constellation guiding them forward. The bench, once a monument to waiting, became a symbol of arrival. No promises, no spoken reassurance, only a beginning. Night settled, soft and unthreatening. The world kept moving around them, yet for these few minutes, time stood still. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't thunderous or loud. They arrive in small, ordinary places, like a rain-soaked bench, a warm cup of cocoa, or the quiet courage it takes to come back to someone you love. When broken hearts choose to return instead of run, when forgiveness rises where resentment once lived, that is God moving in the subtle corners of life. He sends reminders in unexpected forms, a loyal doe, a stranger who stops, a moment you didn't plan, to show that we are never truly alone. If this story touched a part of your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and may God bless you with the courage to believe that love still finds its way back, even when it feels impossible.